Everyone wants power, but most misunderstand where it begins. It's not in domination or in being louder or in winning arguments. It starts with emotional untouchability. The moment you stop giving others the power to disturb your peace, you've already won a battle most people don't even know they're fighting. Carl Jung understood this better than anyone. He believed that the path to inner strength didn't start with control over others. It started with self-mastery. But before we go deeper, subscribe, like, and write in the comments where you're watching this from. Let's see who's really paying attention, because this message isn't for the comfortable. It's for the ones standing on the edge of something unfamiliar, staring down the parts of themselves they know they can't carry any longer. Think about how often your mood depends on someone else's behavior. A text left unread ruins your day. A backhanded comment makes you spiral. A small rejection opens the floodgates of self-doubt. And we tell ourselves this is normal. That feeling deeply is a sign of authenticity, of being alive. But Jung would say, if your emotions are ruled by the outside world, you're not living, you're reacting. And reaction is slavery. You see, Jung's psychology wasn't just about healing. It was about individuation, the process of becoming whole. That means integrating the broken parts of yourself, yes, but also detaching from the roles, masks, and emotional addictions that keep you entangled in other people's chaos. And here's the hard truth. If you're still triggered, you're still trapped. That's not judgment. That's an invitation to go deeper. When you begin to observe your emotions rather than obey them, you step outside the prison of reaction. When someone insults you and you don't flinch, when they try to manipulate you and you don't bite, when they disappear and you don't chase, you've already risen above the battlefield. Because power doesn't scream, power doesn't chase, power doesn't explain. Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That's your starting point. Not vengeance, not defense, but observation, self-awareness. Why does that person's disapproval shake you? Why does their silence feel like punishment? If you can answer that, not with a story, but with raw, uncomfortable honesty, you're already breaking the chains. This is not about becoming cold. It's about becoming rooted. And once you stop seeking emotional safety from the very people who destabilize you, your power becomes unshakable. That is the beginning of emotional sovereignty. And once you taste it, you will never settle for anything less. People think power is about dominance, about money, status, influence. But Carl Jung knew better. Real power doesn't come from what you can control outside. It comes from what you can command within. And here's the paradox. The less you react, the more you control. Not because you're pretending, but because you've outgrown the game. Look around. Most people are emotionally hijacked every single day. A passive-aggressive remark throws them off. A partner's silence derails their self-worth. A colleague's success triggers jealousy. They live in constant reaction, fired off by everything and anchored by nothing. That's not strength. That's volatility with a mask on. Jung warned us about this state of emotional possession. When your unconscious wounds drive your behavior, and you mistake your triggers for truth. He taught that what you're most reactive to often reveals where you're most unhealed. And if you're brave enough to trace that discomfort to its source, not suppress it, not project it, but study it, you start to gain something most people never even aim for: self-mastery. This is why emotional detachment isn't apathy. It's precision. It means you don't waste energy on what doesn't matter. It means you stop personalizing every slight, every delay, every rejection. It means you let people be who they are, without letting that dictate who you become. Most people are terrified of this kind of detachment because it threatens the identity they've built on being the caretaker, the fixer, the empath, the savior. But Jung would say, if your kindness is rooted in fear, it's not kindness, it's control. If your compassion is a disguise for self-abandonment, it's not virtue, it's avoidance. True emotional strength isn't loud, it's not performative, it's silent, stable, and terrifyingly still. And here's the most important part. When you develop this kind of calm, manipulative people will find you impossible to use. Because you no longer take the bait. You no longer rush to defend, to explain, to please. You watch, you understand, and then you choose. Consciously, cleanly, without chaos. That is what Jung meant by integration. That is power. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides in politeness, in overthinking, in keeping the peace to avoid conflict. Sometimes fear disguises itself as loyalty to people who've long since stopped being loyal to you, or as responsibility toward situations that no longer serve your growth. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He believed that fear, especially unconscious fear, is the real jailer of the human spirit. It convinces you to stay small, to stay quiet, to stay stuck. It wraps itself in rational excuses, in the appearance of reasonableness. But beneath it all, it is still fear. The modern world feeds this fear like a parasite feeds off a host. It whispers, don't rock the boat, don't speak your mind, don't walk away from what's familiar. And so people stay in broken relationships, in dead-end jobs, in fake friendships, because fear tells them the unknown is worse. Because fear says at least what you know, you can survive. But Jung would tell you this. Anything you cling to out of fear is already costing you your freedom. And freedom, real, internal freedom, requires loss. You will lose comfort. You will lose people. You will lose illusions. That's the price. But what you gain in return is priceless. Self-respect, clarity, and peace. You see, fear is what keeps most people in patterns that slowly destroy them. They fear confrontation, so they tolerate disrespect. They fear loneliness, so they accept half-love. They fear failure, so they never start. They fear being seen as selfish, so they keep giving to those who only take. And the tragedy is, they don't even realize that they're worshiping fear. They've built their lives around avoiding it instead of facing it. Jung's work pushes you to confront the shadow, the dark, rejected parts of yourself that hold the key to your power. But you cannot face the shadow if you're still worshiping safety. You cannot become who you're meant to be while kneeling before your fears. And here's the truth. Fear never fully goes away. The point isn't to be fearless. That's a fantasy sold in movies and motivational speeches. The point is to stop being ruled by it, to feel it, name it, and then move anyway. That's courage. That's maturity. And most importantly, that's when you stop being prey. Because people can smell fear. Manipulators use it to shape your behavior. Systems profit off it by selling you solutions to problems you wouldn't have if you weren't afraid. But when you stare fear in the face and say, I'm doing it anyway, you become untouchable in a way no one can fake. Let others be ruled by fear. Let them stay comfortable and controlled, numbing themselves with distractions, routines, and illusions. But not you. Not anymore. You have a choice. To keep living in chains you pretend not to see, or to break them and walk away from the prison you didn't know you were in. One of the most subtle forms of bondage is the illusion that you are in control. It's the lie that convinces you everything is fine as long as you're planning, preparing, managing every detail. That if you just try a little harder, please a little more, predict every outcome, you'll finally be safe. But Carl Jung understood that what most people call control is really just fear wearing a disciplined face. It's a desperate attempt to guard against chaos. The chaos of being disliked, the chaos of rejection, of failure, of the unknown. And here's the brutal truth. The tighter you grip, the more control slips through your fingers. The person who needs to control everything is already owned by their anxiety. They become hypervigilant, endlessly tired, emotionally drained. They walk through life in armor, bracing for impact, yet never feeling peace. And they confuse this tension for strength. But it's not strength, it's survival. Jung believed that true strength comes not from resisting the unpredictable, but from accepting it. The psyche becomes whole not by force, but by surrender. Not to others, but to truth. When you realize that control is a myth, you start focusing on what actually matters. Your reactions, your boundaries, your self-awareness. You can't stop the world from turning, but you can choose how you meet it. Think about it. How many things have you tried to control that only ended up controlling you? Relationships where you over-explained yourself to be understood. Workplaces where you bent over backward to be irreplaceable. Social situations where you played a role just to be liked. That's not control, that's performance. And every time you perform, you lose a little bit of your authenticity. You trade your inner peace for outer approval. You spend your life managing appearances instead of facing reality. And deep down, you know it. You feel it. In the anxiety, in the resentment, in the exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. Jung's call was to individuation, to become whole, to become yourself. But you cannot do that while you are still addicted to controlling how others see you, how they respond, or how they behave. You cannot be free while you are still scripting everyone else's part in your story. Real freedom begins where your obsession with control ends. It begins when you realize that your power was never in the outcome. It was always in your presence. It was in your ability to let go and still be grounded, to be in the storm and not be consumed by it. That is the quiet, unshakable power Jung pointed to. That is the control that no one can take from you. Because it was never about them to begin with. Fear is one of the most powerful forces in the human psyche, not because of what it protects you from, but because of what it quietly trains you to worship. Fear doesn't just influence behavior, it reshapes identity. Over time, it becomes the lens through which you interpret everything. Your value, your relationships, your choices, your limits. Carl Jung warned that what you do not face in your unconscious will appear in your life as fate. And fear, when left unexamined, becomes that fate. It becomes the silent God you serve, obeyed without question, defended without thought. You avoid certain people, paths, opportunities, not because they're wrong, but because fear tells you they're dangerous. And because fear whispers with the voice of reason, you believe it. Look closer. How many things in your life have been shaped not by desire, but by avoidance? How many times have you said no to growth because fear convinced you it was risk? That relationship you didn't pursue, that boundary you didn't set, that truth you didn't speak. Fear doesn't need to scream to control you. It just needs to become familiar. It needs to sound like your own voice. That's when it wins. When it convinces you that protection is peace, that silence is safety, that staying small is wise. And once it does, you stop living. You start maintaining. You start surviving instead of expanding. And slowly, without realizing it, you build a life that revolves around not being hurt instead of being whole. Jung's work teaches us that fear is not the enemy. Denial is. Repression is. Pretending you're not afraid while you let that fear dictate your life is what truly costs you. Because every day you don't confront your fear, you feed it. You hand it your agency, your voice, your potential. Fear is not conquered by courage alone. It's transformed through awareness. The moment you can look at your fear and name it, it begins to lose power. Because now, it's not a god. It's a part of you. A part that can be understood, integrated, and even respected, but never worshipped. And this is where true detachment begins. Not in pretending you don't care, not in acting unbothered, but in refusing to let fear shape your choices, in choosing truth over comfort, in letting your inner compass guide you, not your wound. Emotional detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity. And clarity doesn't follow fear, it follows self-knowledge. That is what Jung was after. Not escape, but transformation. Not a hardened shell, but an open soul no longer ruled by invisible gods. There's a reason you cling to your pain. A reason you keep replaying that betrayal, that rejection, that failure. It's not because you want to suffer. It's because at some point, your suffering became your identity. Carl Jung believed that we all develop a persona, a mask to navigate the world. But deeper than that, we form attachments to the roles we believe define us. The abandoned one, the betrayed one, the misunderstood one. These aren't just emotional states, they're identities. And once your identity fuses with your wound, you will unconsciously seek situations that confirm it. This is the hidden cost of emotional over-identification. You don't just feel pain, you become it. You live through it, speak through it, connect through it. It becomes your lens, your language, your compass. And the worst part, it makes healing feel like death. Because to let go of the wound means letting go of who you've known yourself to be. It means losing the emotional gravity that's given your life meaning, even if that meaning is built on suffering. This is why so many people sabotage healing. They think they want peace, but what they really want is familiarity. And pain, for many, is the most familiar thing they know. But Jung reminds us, healing is not about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you who to be. Emotional detachment begins the moment you stop defining yourself by what happened to you and start reconnecting to the self that existed before the wound. That self isn't reactive. It doesn't need to prove, please, or perform. It just is. And it's still in you, buried beneath the noise, waiting to be reclaimed. True detachment is not an escape from feeling. It's a refusal to let feeling be the whole story. When you detach, you're not denying your past. You're dismantling the identity it built without your consent. You're stepping out of the emotional costume and asking, for the first time, who am I without this pain? That's not just a question, that's a turning point. Because once you realize you are not your emotion, you're the witness to it. You unlock a kind of freedom most people never taste. And in that space, healing isn't a destination, it's a return. There comes a point where silence is no longer passive. It becomes protective. Where not explaining yourself isn't rude, it's self-respect. This is where the power of emotional detachment reveals its sharpest edge. Because most people don't understand this. Detachment isn't disconnection. It's redirection. It's choosing where your energy goes instead of handing it out like spare change to anyone who demands it. Carl Jung saw the unconscious as a reservoir of strength, but only for those brave enough to retreat into it, to sit with themselves long enough to hear the voice that doesn't speak in words. That voice, that still small presence, is what we silence every time we overreact, over-explain, or overextend. In a world obsessed with visibility, withdrawing can feel like death. It triggers every fear: being forgotten, being replaced, being misunderstood. But that's the test. When you detach, when you retreat from the noise, you come face to face with what you truly fear losing. And here's the truth. What you fear losing often has more control over you than you care to admit. Detachment strips that illusion bare. It reveals what's real, because anything that can't survive your silence was never stable to begin with. And anything that demands your constant emotional availability isn't love, it's control. This is why Jung's model of individuation is not just spiritual, it's revolutionary. It calls you to break the spell of needing others to confirm who you are. It urges you to withdraw, not out of bitterness, but out of sovereignty. To pull your energy back from relationships, roles, and routines that have made you smaller, more reactive, more fragile. And to do this not as an act of war, but as an act of remembrance. When you practice emotional detachment, you don't cut yourself off from life. You come back to it on your own terms. You stop living from reaction and start acting from intention. You stop asking, "How do they see me?" and start asking, "What part of me have I been ignoring just to stay visible?" In this silence, in this inner withdrawal, a new self begins to emerge. Not louder, not angrier, but clearer. And in a noisy world, clarity is power. Emotional detachment isn't coldness, it's containment. It's knowing that just because someone throws a spark doesn't mean you have to catch fire. It's learning to hold space for your own inner world without constantly leaking it into others. Because your peace is not a performance, and you don't owe anyone access to it. Not anymore. Detachment scares people. Not because it's cruel, but because it breaks the unspoken contracts they've written for you. The expectation that you will always be the one who answers, who softens, who gives more than they do. When you become emotionally detached, you stop playing the role they've assigned you. You stop feeding the dynamics that made you feel needed but not respected. And when you do that, people panic. Not because they've lost you, but because they've lost control over how you make them feel about themselves. This is where fear kicks in, not just theirs, yours too. Because when you no longer base your self-worth on how well you manage others' emotions, you're left with a terrifying question. Who are you when you're no longer a mirror for other people's needs? That void is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Because in that silence, you're confronted with every part of yourself that you buried to be loved, accepted, or admired. Jung called this the shadow, the denied self, the side of you that's been waiting for you to stop performing long enough to be seen. Emotional detachment forces this confrontation. It strips away the justifications, the stories, the excuses. You realize how much of your life has been dictated by fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood. But here's the breakthrough. The more you detach, the more you see that those fears were never proof of danger. They were symptoms of dependency. And when you stop needing people to approve of you, validate you, or even understand you, that's when you finally start to feel free. So yes, detachment will cost you. It will cost you comfort, identity, and maybe even a few relationships built on the illusion of who you had to be. But what it gives back is far more valuable. Peace, autonomy, and the inner authority to no longer betray yourself just to keep the peace outside of you. The fear you feel is not a sign to go back. It's a sign that you're walking away from the version of you that was never truly free. There's a kind of strength that no one talks about. The strength of becoming unreachable. Not in the sense of isolation or arrogance, but in the deeper sense of no longer being emotionally available to the games, manipulations, and projections of others. Most people don't realize that their suffering doesn't come from the world, but from their access points. The places where they're still trying to prove, defend, or explain themselves to people who don't actually want to understand. Becoming unreachable means sealing off those access points. It means no longer offering your clarity to confusion, no longer handing your peace over to chaos. This is what Nietzsche hinted at when he spoke of rising above the herd. He wasn't talking about superiority in the egoic sense. He was talking about transcendence, the kind that comes from inner detachment, from the refusal to let small minds shrink your inner world. When you reach this level, people start to notice, not because you're louder, but because you're no longer reacting. You're no longer trying to belong to places that drain you. You're no longer explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. And in a world that thrives on emotional chaos, your calm becomes terrifying. Being unreachable isn't about being cold. It's about being precise with your energy. It's about recognizing that your attention is currency, your time is sacred, and your inner world is not a public space. You stop entertaining what exhausts you. You stop giving CPR to relationships that only breathe when you're suffering. You stop running back into burning buildings just because someone else forgot how to hold a match. And slowly, your life starts to reflect that shift. It gets quieter, simpler, but also heavier with truth. The people who remain in your life are no longer there out of obligation or manipulation. They're there because they resonate with your truth, not your performance. They don't feed off your reactions. They respect your boundaries. And that's when you know. You've stopped surviving through connection and started living through alignment. You've become unreachable to everything that once controlled you. And that is real freedom. There's a reason the most powerful people in history weren't the loudest. They were the calmest. They spoke rarely, but when they did, people listened. They weren't scattered by every opinion, every insult, every new headline. Their minds were still, focused, deliberate. And in a world built to keep you distracted, reactive, and overstimulated, that kind of quiet focus is not just rare, it's dangerous. Nietzsche understood this. He believed the strongest minds were those that had trained themselves to detach from the chaos of the collective. He called it overcoming the herd instinct. Not because you think you're better, but because you've realized that following the noise only leads you further from yourself. The quiet mind is the one that stopped chasing validation. It stopped negotiating its values for temporary comfort. It doesn't explode in anger or collapse in self-pity. It simply sees. To get to this level, you need to unlearn the habit of constant reaction. Every time you check your phone for likes, every time you rehearse an argument in your head, every time you try to win someone over, you're scattering your energy. You're leaking your power. And worst of all, you're training your nervous system to believe that peace is dangerous and chaos is normal. But when you begin to pull that energy back, when you resist the impulse to reply, to defend, to explain, you start to feel something different. Silence, space, clarity. That's where real strength lives. The quiet mind is not passive. It's not disinterested. It's razor sharp. It notices what others miss. It makes decisions from principle, not panic. It can walk away without needing to slam the door. It can endure discomfort without reaching for distraction. And it's in that silence, that vision is born. The kind of vision that builds lives rooted in truth, not performance. The kind of vision that rewrites what you tolerate, what you pursue, and what you allow to enter your space. The world doesn't teach you to think like this. It teaches you to react, to fear, to chase. But if you can train your mind to be quiet, to be still in the storm, you become untouchable. You move differently. You see through people. You stop falling for the same emotional traps. You no longer crave the noise. You begin to crave peace, precision, purpose. And in that craving, in that shift, you reclaim the one thing most people never realize they lost: your mind. Your quiet, dangerous, sovereign mind.